ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Hi News Daily listeners. I'm Danielle O'Neill and I've got a new podcast I want to share with you. It's called Expanse, Uncropped. And at a time where it feels like division is the norm, I've gone back to a story from the 60s that was incredibly divisive to try and see what lessons we can learn. It's a wild story with farmers and UFOs and media pylons. Check it out by following Expanse on the ABC Listen app.
You may have heard of home births, but free birthing, where there are no medical professionals present, is a small but increasing practice in Australia. So why are some women turning away from traditional hospital births and medical intervention? Today, investigative reporter Charlotte King on the movement putting lives at risk. And just be aware, this episode discusses stillbirth and birth trauma. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Charlotte, most women in Australia give birth in hospitals, but there are other options, and over time, home births and free births, as they're known, they're becoming more popular, aren't they?
That's right. So in Australia, overwhelmingly women have their babies in hospitals. So 97% of women give birth in hospital. Home birth is another option for them. So home births require 2 midwives who are registered with the National Health Regulator, AHPRA, to be present at the birth. The third option outside of that hospital birth, home birth situation is a free birth.
Yeah, okay, and that's what we're really going to have a look at free birth, because that is also an option that women are increasingly taking up. Just tell me what it is, first of all.
So free birthing is basically when you choose to birth outside the hospital on purpose with no medical professional at all. So no doctor, no midwife, no home birth midwife, no nothing. Some women do it alone or with their partner at home.
Wow.
Others employ a birth worker. They call themselves birth keepers or doulas. And these birth workers don't have any medical qualifications, but they do charge a fee to attend anyway. So they can't navigate an emergency, but they're there sort of for emotional support and encouragement for the women. There's no data on free births, so we don't actually know how many are occurring at the moment in Australia. But the main way that we can measure it is that Queensland Health Department has actually separated out the limited data that it does have around planned free births that end up in hospital transfers. So these are just the free births that end up needing emergency support. So it shows that there were 14 reported free births in 2021, and that jumped to 39 in 2022. So again, these are just the births that end up in some kind of emergency situation where they have to go into hospital. So this isn't it's not an illegal practice. You can, women can birth wherever they want really, but it's just not, free births aren't monitored or regulated in any way by the health system in the way that other births are.
But, Charlotte, for a lot of women, it would seem like a really risky option that they just would never take. So why on earth, for some women, is it an option? Why would they choose to do this?
Yeah, and it's just such a key question, isn't it? And there's no sort of single reason why women choose free birth. But then there is also evidence that for a lot of women, it's actually not their first choice. One of the key driving forces behind that is a desire to avoid hospital at all costs, and this sort of distrust in the medical system and the way that it approaches birth. And a lot of that comes back to birth trauma.
Yeah, so now just explain what birth trauma actually is, because it has it's a broad definition really.
Yeah, it really is. And there's a few different definitions, but essentially it covers physical injury, psychological distress or disrespectful treatment during childbirth. So we've had this New South Wales parliamentary inquiry that looked into birth trauma in 2023 for the first time. It received more than 4,000 submissions from women. There was graphic testimony from mothers who'd had deep trauma from interventions, infant loss, psychological injuries stemming from their treatment in hospital. And the inquiry found that a lot of this harm was preventable or occurred through medical negligence. So we already knew from surveys that have been done that about a third of women in Australia experience birth trauma in some way through a hospital birth. And this inquiry described the preventable harm as a form of violence and called for urgent efforts to address it.
Okay, well, that's all pretty concerning, but I guess we should point out that it's not just birth trauma or surveys that have been done into that is concerning women. There is also an online movement advocating for free birth, isn't there, that is having an influence?
Yeah, there is. And look, some of that stems from that sort of trauma background and the way that hospitals approach birth, but it's sort of also taken on a life of its own. And this, by all accounts, has really ramped up during and after COVID. So there's quite a lot of crossover with women who are opposed to vaccinations or any kind of state involvement in their lives. There are these social media communities that have really rallied around this idea of pushing back against hospital birth. So the idea of free birth in that online world is to birth as nature intended, not disturbed by any kind of outside forces, away from hospital timeframes, even for really, pregnancies that a lot of people would consider high risk, so like twins and breech births and things like that. And in those communities, there's those who articulate a really deep distrust for medical institutions. Some of them describe these home birth midwives as sort of sabotaging births with unnecessary intervention, if they use any, gloves to handle the baby and things like that. It's really quite extreme, this mindset. And there's also this blind faith in a woman's ability to give birth, basically no matter the circumstances.
All right, but it is so risky, right, to go down this path, especially, Charlotte, when we live in a nation where we have a relatively good medical system.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, for a lot of women, like you say, this seems, crazy. Why would you birth without any kind of assistance? At the end of the day, it does appear to be a massive roll of the dice. The number of women who aim to free birth but end up in hospital has tripled in Queensland, which is the only state that has that data. And by its nature, because it occurs outside regulation, it's impossible to say with certainty exactly how risky it is. What's particularly concerning is that the workers in this space are birth workers who don't have medical qualifications, are being paid thousands of dollars for their services, when in some circumstances they are absolutely not offering sufficient advice, and in the worst cases they're outright misleading their clients.
Well, Charlotte, to get a better understanding of this, tell me Alice's story. You spoke to her, although because it's such a very sensitive issue, we've kept her anonymous and we've got someone else to voice what she told you. And she decided that a free birth was the best option for her, didn't she?
She had already delivered 2 babies through the public hospital system. Both of those births had ended in a caesarean. And the second had deeply affected her. For a long time, she couldn't even speak about it. It was a surprise caesarean that came about after a routine checkup when she was at full term in her pregnancy, and it just ripped the carpet out from underneath her.
It was so fast because the pregnancy had been fine, and then I was in for a C-section within 2 hours. So it was just like, wow, what just happened? How did that happen? Was it necessary?
So she wanted more control over her experience, and for her that was birthing at home. But when she approached midwives, home birth midwives, and told them that she'd had a double C-section, they all said no. Midwives are often quite cautious not to take on mothers that are considered, quote unquote high risk. So Alice was left without that option, and instead she'd heard about a woman who had no medical training but appeared to have a range of experience with off-grid births, and she came highly recommended from a friend. Anyway, she agreed to support Alice's pregnancy and birth. It was going to cost Alice $5,500. And because she was unregistered, this woman, and had no medical training, it would basically be a free birth.
The one thing that I had to have from my support person was that they were able to spot red flags, because the hospital was always going to be there. So that was asked within our initial meeting. Are you able to spot red flags? Should I need to go to the hospital? The answer was yes.
So what happened?
The labour did go pear-shaped. As the hours dragged on, night turned to day, something just felt off, and the labour wasn't progressing as Alice understood that it should. The birth worker does this vaginal examination, and she tells Alice that she could feel the baby's head. But after another 3 hours, she still doesn't feel the need to push. And at this point, it kind of clicks in her head that she needs to go to hospital. And when she gets in, the hospital midwife examines her, and she comes to a completely different conclusion to the birth worker.
She said, that's not a head. She did a little wiggle. She said, I'm pretty sure I can feel a shoulder.
So she needed an emergency C-section. And the moment her baby boy was born, she went into complete shock and panic.
I know the baby's come out misshapen anyway, but the back of his head was touching his back. And I immediately started questioning, had he been deprived of oxygen? Do we now have a brain-damaged baby? And I was just saying, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. I was saying it to my partner as well, like, I can't believe what I've done.
Thankfully, in the end, Alice was okay and her baby boy made a full recovery. But she said that hospital staff did confirm that her and her baby's life were put at risk by continuing to labour when he was stuck. And Alice says that it was absolutely her choice alone to have a free birth. She accepts that was her decision, but she feels like she was completely misled about the skill set of her birth worker.
All right, well, Charlotte, it does sound very much like in some cases free birth is the Wild West, and you've actually heard many stories like Alice's, and some of them much worse.
That's right. So a key revelation that we made in this story was that the same birth worker who thought that Alice's baby's shoulder was a head was actually also employed as the birth worker for 3 baby deaths between 2022 and 2024, and all of them are before the New South Wales coroner. But there are other birth workers who also go beyond their sort of emotional support role. I've spoken with parents who've lost their baby or had catastrophic near misses in free births, and that they were told later by medical professionals that their baby's death may have been avoided if a trained midwife was in attendance.
Gosh, it's really worrying. So how do we actually address a movement like this? Can it be made safer for the women that want to partake in it?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's a simple solution, but the way that Hannah Darlin, the midwifery professor that I spoke with, described it, I thought was pretty apt. She said that there's currently this chasm between 2 imperfect worlds. One of those worlds is mainstream services where staff step in too fast. And then there is the free birth world, which has what she described as an unquestioning trust of nature and physiology without the people who can support that or inform it accurately. So I guess her point is that we need to create a better world in the middle that provides women more informed choices about the care that they can access. Home birth is one option. The parents that we spoke to all would have preferred a home birth midwife but just couldn't access one. And there's only a handful of public programs and private midwives are spread really thin across the country. Ultimately, health services and hospitals need to work to re-establish trust in the system and provide a better service, basically. I guess women have a right to make an informed choice on how they birth and who they birth with, but as it stands, there's a long way to go on that front.
Charlotte King is an investigative reporter with the ABC. If this episode has brought up issues for you, you can call Panda's National Perinatal Mental Health Helpline on 1800 011 511. This episode was produced by Sydney Peat, Cara Jensen McKinnon, and Sam Dunn. Audio production by Anna John. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.